They say, on one forgotten spring day in ancient Rome, laughter saved the city from darkness. Not a soldier lifted his sword. No priest knelt at the altars. And yet, the shadows fled. They say the marble streets laughed that day. Statues smiled for the first time in centuries. And the dead, yes, even the dead, were driven away by the sound of joy. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? But I was there, and I saw him, a boy with eyes far too old for his young face, a mask too heavy for his small hands, and a smile that did not belong to this world. This is not a story you'll find in the scrolls of history. But tonight, if you'll stay with me, I'll take you there, to the day when Rome remembered how to laugh. And for a brief, shining moment, even the darkest spirits had no choice but to listen. Welcome, dear traveler, to POV Historical Stories for Sleep. Here we don't just remember history. We walk through it together. So close your eyes now, let your thoughts slow, and when you're ready, come with me. Through the marble streets of a forgotten spring, I still remember that day. Spring had arrived in Rome in its own quiet way. The sun rose gently over the Tiber River, its light slipping between towering columns and casting golden patterns across the worn reliefs of temples older than anyone could recall. There was no harshness to it, only warmth, a soft, embracing warmth that made even the cold marble beneath my feet feel almost alive. My sandals whispered against the stone as I walked each step, a quiet echo through the empty streets. High above, pigeons shuffled and cooed beneath the grand arches, their wings rustling softly in the morning calm. And then, that scent. The scent I hadn't known I missed until that very moment. It was the promise of ripening grapes from the far vineyards beyond the Tiber, carried gently on the breeze. The sharp, fresh bite of rosemary and thyme crushed beneath passing feet, blending with the faint, smoky warmth of bread just pulled from clay ovens. And then, sweeter still, honeyed almonds roasting somewhere close by. Their sweetness curled through the air like a memory, a reminder that winter had finally passed. I stood there motionless, just breathing it all in. For years, my world had been stone and silence, chisels, dust, statues that never smiled back. But that day, something felt different. That's when Lucilla found me. She had lived in the southern quarter for as long as I could remember. Old as the stones, she walked on with more wrinkles than there were cracks in the marble streets. But her smile? Her smile was as wide and bright as the spring sky itself. You're not hiding from the festival again this year, are you, Gaius? She teased, her sharp eyes sparkling beneath the frayed edge of her worn straw hat. I offered the same tired excuse I'd given every year. Work to finish, commissions waiting, unshaped stone. But before I could step away, she reached out with surprising strength and pressed something into my palm. A mask, crude, rough, made of simple clay. Its wide, ridiculous grin stretched impossibly across the uneven surface. The eyes were large and exaggerated, carved hastily, but strangely alive. Lucilla leaned closer, then her voice low, almost as if she were sharing a sacred secret. Today, she whispered, "Even the gods expect you to laugh, old friend, and you wouldn't want to disappoint them, would you?" Before I could answer, she was already moving away her basket of painted masks, swaying gently with each step. disappearing into the growing hum of the city. I stood there for a long while, staring down at the absurd little mask in my hands. And that's when I heard it. At first it was faint, just a soft ripple on the breeze. Laughter? Not the harsh, mocking laughter of Roman senators, not the drunken howls of men in the taverns. This was something pure, full, warm, unrestrained. It rolled across the rooftops like a breeze itself, winding through alleyways and dancing through the grand arches above. Before I knew what was happening, my feet were already moving. Toward the sound, toward the great square, toward Jupiter's temple, and the day that would change everything. The closer I walked toward the forum, the more the air seemed to change. It wasn't just warmer now, it was lighter, almost charged with something I couldn't explain. And then, the first real swell of laughter reached me. It rolled through the stone arches like a living thing, full and deep, rising and falling in waves. And it wasn't just from one place. It echoed from every corner of the city's heart, as if the marble itself was learning to laugh. As I crossed into the forum, the great square opened before me, vast and alive with color. Silken banners in hues of crimson and deep gold fluttered from every pillar and balcony. Stalls lined the edges of the square, their canopies striped and bright. But these weren't merchants selling bread or cloth. They were mask sellers, jugglers, dancers balancing on thin ropes stretched impossibly high between columns. And at the center of it all, rising above the throng like a mountain of stone and glory, stood Jupiter's temple. I had walked past that temple hundreds of times in my life, but I had never really seen it. Not like this. The grand staircase leading up to the entrance had been draped in bright fabrics, their ends curling gently in the spring breeze. Statues that usually stood solemn and unmoving had been adorned with garlands of ivy and fresh flowers. Even the carved faces of the gods themselves seemed softer somehow, as if amused by the day's peculiar events. And there, upon the topmost step, stood a man unlike any I had seen before. He was tall and thin, dressed not in the pristine white of a Roman priest, but in a ridiculous, oversized robe patched together from dozens of brightly colored fabrics. The robe hung loosely from his thin frame, embroidered with hundreds of grinning faces stitched in gold thread. Atop his head sat a towering hat, shaped like a great crooked nose, bright red and impossible to ignore. He raised his arms high, and his voice boomed across the square, not in prayer, but in a long, drawn-out, utterly absurd laugh. It started low and slow, rumbling like distant thunder. Then it climbed higher and higher until the sound burst from his chest in a wild, ringing peal that echoed through every stone archway of the forum. And without hesitation, the crowd joined him. Thousands of voices lifted at once, laughing freely, wildly, some with genuine joy, others with the awkwardness of those who had long forgotten how. I felt it then, a pull in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. Before I knew it, I was laughing too. At first it felt strange, almost like trying to speak a language I had forgotten. But as the sound left my throat, as the air filled my lungs and my shoulders shook with it, I remembered. For that one brief moment, nothing else mattered. The debts, the worries, the stone that never shaped quite right. They melted away in the warmth of that shared, unstoppable laughter. As I stood there, mask still clutched tightly in my hand, I noticed something, or rather, someone, at the far edge of the great staircase. A boy, small, barefoot. He wore a simple tunic, but his hands gripped a mask far too large for him, its painted grin exaggerated and almost unsettling. And his eyes, they were old, far too old for his face, dark, thoughtful, and still, as if he were watching the entire city from some distant place I could never quite reach. For a brief moment amidst the chaos of laughter and celebration, our eyes met. He tilted his head slightly, and though his lips did not move, I could swear I saw his eyes smile. But then just as quickly he turned and disappeared behind the columns of the temple. I blinked and he was gone. Had I imagined him? The thought barely had time to settle before a great gong rang out from the temple's entrance, and the laughter slowly died down to an expectant hush. The man in the absurd robe, the high priest of laughter, as I later learned, raised his arms again, and in a voice rich and commanding, he called out to the crowd. Today we do not beg the gods for favor. We do not bow our heads in sorrow or sacrifice. Today we remind the shadows why they fear the light. With that, he threw his head back and laughed again, long and loud, and the square erupted once more. But as the sounds of joy filled the air, I couldn't shake the image of that boy. The way he held the mask, the way his ancient eyes seemed to know something the rest of us didn't. And somewhere deep inside, I felt that today's laughter was not just for joy. It was for protection. And as the sun climbed higher over the shining marble rooftops, a strange thought settled in my mind. If what they said was true, if laughter could drive away the darkness, then today we were not just celebrating. We were defending the city. I left the square before the midday sun reached its peak. While the city roared with laughter and celebration, I found myself drawn elsewhere, pulled by something quieter, heavier, something that echoed in the empty spaces of my heart. My feet led me back to a place I rarely visited anymore, my workshop. A humble space tucked beneath the shadow of the Palatine Hill, its walls lined with half-finished statues and blocks of marble that had waited far too long for my hands to return. The air inside was cool and thick, with the scent of stone dust and old oil lamps. The chisel marks on the floor seemed more permanent than any work I had ever completed. And there, standing in the center of it all, was the one sculpture I had never found the strength to finish. It was meant to be my masterpiece, a figure of a man, not a god, not a hero, but a simple man, strong, weathered by life, his head bowed slightly in quiet reflection. But the face had never been completed. I had left it smooth and blank, unable or perhaps unwilling to carve the final expression. For years I told myself it was because I hadn't yet found the right emotion to shape into stone. But deep down, I knew the truth. I couldn't give the statue a face because I had forgotten how to carve joy. I approached the figure, slowly running my fingers over the cool, unfinished marble. The mask Lucilla had given me was still clutched tightly in my other hand, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I lifted it gently and placed it against the blank face of the statue. It fit almost perfectly. A crude, ridiculous grin stretched across the smooth, uncarved features. And in that moment, in the cold stillness of my silent workshop, I swear to you, I heard it. A faint, impossible sound. Laughter, not loud, not echoing from the streets above. But from here, From this quiet, forgotten space, a low, warm chuckle as if the stone itself remembered how to laugh. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I searched the shadows for the source, but I was alone, completely alone. And yet the sound lingered soft and comforting like the fading memory of a dream. I looked at the statue again, with that foolish mask perched on its face. For the first time it seemed alive, not proud or heroic, not sorrowful or tragic, just alive. Content in a way I had long forgotten was possible. And as I stood there breathing, slowly letting the moment settle, I thought of the boy again, his dark, knowing eyes, the way he carried his own oversized mask. I remembered how even in the middle of the roaring festival, he had stood perfectly still watching, as if he knew that some of us needed more than a celebration. We needed to remember who we were beneath the weight of sorrow, beneath the years of silence. We needed to feel light again. And as the last echoes of that mysterious laughter faded into the cool stone walls, I realized something else. The Festival of Laughter wasn't just about driving away spirits or pleasing the gods. It was about freeing ourselves from the grief we carried, from the regrets we polished like worn stones in our pockets, from the heaviness that kept our eyes low and our hearts closed. And for the first time in years, I wanted to finish the statue, not with the solemn dignity I had originally planned, but with a face that laughed, a face that lived. I turned toward my tools, my fingers tracing the familiar shapes of the chisels. The stone would be ready when I was, but first, I needed to return to the square, because something told me the festival wasn't over yet. And somewhere, amidst the laughter and firelight, that boy would be waiting. By the time I returned to the square, the sun was already leaning westward, casting long shadows across the marble courtyards. The air was thick now, not heavy with heat, but dense with the mingling sense of celebration. Roasted figs dripping with honey, loaves of bread shaped like smiling faces, their crusts golden, and split wide as if they too shared in the day's joy. And everywhere I turned, I saw food prepared not simply for eating, but for amusement. A table stretched the entire length of the forum, covered in dishes sculpted into absurd shapes. Grapes arranged like miniature towers, resembling the crooked hats worn by the high priests of laughter. Flatbreads carved with exaggerated frowns placed next to bowls of sweet olive paste, meant to turn their expressions happy with a single playful smear. Children darted between the tables, their faces painted in wild colors, eyes wide behind oversized masks that bobbed as they ran. And at the center of it all, a great bronze basin stood brimming with a strange golden liquid that seemed to glow under the late afternoon sun. It was the famed vinum risus, the wine of laughter, a drink made from the lightest of spring's first grapes, sweetened with rare mountain herbs and a touch of wild honey. They said just a sip was enough to make even the most stone-hearted soul loosen their jaw and let out a laugh that had been buried for decades. I watched as the festival-goers dipped their goblets into the basin, their faces brightening before the wine even touched their lips, as if the very act of reaching for joy was enough to stir something deep within them. I hesitated. For years I had avoided such things. Joy felt dangerous, unfamiliar. And yet standing there with the golden light falling gently across the square, I realized I was holding my own cup without even thinking. I stepped forward, The high priest himself stood beside the basin. Now his robe a riot of colors, embroidered smiles, seeming to ripple as he moved. When our eyes met, he gave me a knowing nod, as if he had been expecting me all along. "Drink, friend," he said, with a voice as warm and rich as the wine itself. "The day is not done, and the best laughter always comes when the sun begins to fall." So I did. I dipped my goblet into the golden liquid, lifted it to my lips, and drank. The first taste was soft, sweet, but not cloying. It warmed me from the inside out, spreading through my chest, loosening something I hadn't even realized was clenched tight. I felt my shoulders relax, my hands unclenched, and then, without warning, I laughed. It came from somewhere deep and forgotten, a laugh full of surprise rolling up through my chest and out into the air before I could stop it. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and the strangest thing happened. As my laughter faded into the hum of the gathering, I caught sight of him again. The boy, standing just beyond the edge of the celebration, half hidden behind a pillar draped in garlands of ivy. He held the same oversized mask in his small hands, his thin fingers tracing its edges carefully. And his eyes, those impossibly old eyes, met mine once again. He didn't smile this time. He simply watched, calm, still, as if waiting for me to take the next step. But before I could call out to him, he turned and slipped away once more, vanishing into the winding pathways that led toward the upper terraces of the city. For a moment I stood frozen, and then I followed. The boy moved quickly despite his small size and bare feet. Through winding alleys and up narrow staircases carved into the very bones of the city, he led me away from the laughter and music, toward the quieter heights of Rome. The further we climbed, the thinner the sounds of the festival became, until only the echoes of distant mirth reached my ears, carried faintly on the spring breeze. Here above the grand forums and temples, the city felt older and quieter. This was a place where forgotten gods lingered in crumbling shrines, and statues wore cloaks of ivy instead of garlands. I found him standing at the edge of a small abandoned terrace overlooking the city. The marble beneath his feet was cracked and weathered, but from here, all of Rome stretched out before us, a living mosaic of red rooftops, shining domes, and winding streets flooded with celebration. He didn't turn to look at me. Instead, he held the mask up to the fading light of the sun, studying it carefully, as if seeing it for the very first time. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost ageless. "Do you know why they drink the vinum risus?" I swallowed, still catching my breath. "To forget their sorrows, to remember joy." The boy tilted his head. "No, not quite." He lowered the mask and finally turned to me. "Vinum risus is not a drink for forgetting. It is a drink for remembering." I frowned, confused, remembering what I asked. "The truth," he answered simply. "The truth that laughter is not an escape. It's a return to who we really are, before the weight of years made us forget." His gaze drifted back toward the city. "Every year they laugh as if it's a new thing, but it isn't. Laughter was their first language, before grief, before duty, before regret." I stood beside him in silence, the sun painting the horizon with deep shades of gold and violet. And in that quiet moment, I understood. The wine didn't cloud the mind, it cleared it. It stripped away the burdens, the masks we wore every day that had nothing to do with painted clay, and everything to do with the faces we hid from ourselves. The boy spoke again. Do you remember the last time you laughed without fear? Gaius Marcellus. The question struck deeper than I expected, and to my quiet shame, I couldn't answer. I searched my memories for the moment, but it was lost somewhere behind years of chiseling stone and holding my breath through days heavy with sorrow. The boy stepped closer and placed the oversized mask into my hand. This isn't just for celebration, he said softly. It's for healing. He looked up at me one last time, his dark eyes full of something vast and knowing. And then he simply walked away, vanishing down a crumbling stone path that led into the shadows. I wanted to follow to ask him who he really was, but my feet felt rooted to the marble beneath me. Instead, I stood there, holding the mask, feeling the warmth of the Vinum Risus still lingering in my chest. The city below was glowing now, lanterns flickering to life, their lights joining the first faint stars above. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel alone. I sat down on the edge of the terrace, placed the mask beside me, and let the breeze move gently through my hair. And in that quiet as the sky turned to twilight, I did something simple, something I hadn't done in years. I laughed, not loud, not for anyone else to hear, just for myself. And for the man I used to be, before I forgot how. Twilight descended slowly over Rome, not with the sharp finality of nightfall, but like a velvet curtain drawn with careful hands. The streets that once echoed with booming laughter had quieted now their joyous uproar, softening into hushed conversations and gentle hums of old songs. Lanterns swayed gently above the forum, their flames flickering like 1,000 tiny stars brought down to earth. And yet, as the darkness settled, a new kind of anticipation filled the air. I made my way back down from the terrace, the clay mask still warm against my palm. The city felt changed, not empty but expectant, as if every heart in Rome was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen, something final. I returned to the great square where the fires had been lit. At the center, towering above the gathering crowd, stood a great wooden structure, an enormous effigy fashioned from bundled reeds and straw. Its shape was crude, yet unmistakable. A towering figure with a comically large grin carved into its simple face. Around its base, people gathered holding small clay masks, each unique, each bearing the marks of its maker's hand. And then, as if summoned by some silent cue, the high priest of laughter emerged once more, his robe of riotous colors glowing warmly in the firelight. He raised his arms and the square fell into complete silence. Only the soft crackle of flames and the distant song of night birds filled the air. And then his voice rang out, not loud, but deep and resonant, like a familiar song long forgotten. Tonight, he said, we let go. One by one, the people stepped forward, placing their masks at the base of the effigy. With every mask offered, a small weight seemed to lift from their shoulders. I watched them, young and old, rich and poor, all laying down the faces they had worn, the burdens they had carried. Some placed their masks with trembling hands, others with a small, knowing smile. And for a while, I simply stood there, the mask still clutched in my own reluctant hands. The high priest's eyes found me across the crowd. He nodded gently, and in that quiet exchange, I understood. I stepped forward, slowly. The mask felt heavier now, as if all the years I'd carried my silent grief had settled into its simple clay form. I knelt at the base of the effigy, placed the mask carefully among the others. And as I stood, the weight in my chest lifted softly at first, then all at once. It wasn't a dramatic release, no sudden flood of emotion, just peace. A simple, unshakable peace I had thought lost to me forever. Then, with the final mask laid down, the high priest approached the towering figure, a single torch in his hand. His voice rang out once more, softer now, almost tender. Let what was heavy become light. Let what was hidden be seen. And let the old faces fall away, so that we may wear our own again. With a graceful motion, he touched the torch to the base of the effigy. The fire took, quickly climbing the dry reeds with hungry orange tongues. And as the figure burned, the masks began to crack and fall apart, pieces of hardened clay breaking free and crumbling to dust. The air filled with the scent of burning straw, mingled with faint traces of lavender and rosemary, thrown into the flames, a final offering to the gods. And then, a strange thing happened. No one spoke. No one cried. Instead, the people stood together, heads held high, eyes reflecting the dancing light of the fire. It wasn't sorrow they felt. It wasn't even joy. It was freedom. For a long time we stood there, bathed in the warmth of the flames. And when the final ember dimmed, when the last mask had turned to ash and drifted into the night sky, something had changed. Not in the city, in us. For the first time, I looked around and saw faces, real faces, unhidden, unashamed. And in those faces, I found something I had forgotten how to seek: hope. By the time the last flames died, and the final wisp of smoke curled into the star-drenched sky, the crowd had quietly dispersed. No grand farewells, no final speeches, just a shared silent understanding that something had been laid to rest. I found myself walking alone through the winding streets of Rome, the heavy stone walls around me glowing faintly under the silver light of the moon. And as I walked, I noticed it, the absence, the weight I had carried for years, the dull ache of regret, the quiet hum of sorrow that had followed me like a shadow through every narrow alley and along every marble corridor was simply gone. The streets that once felt so cold, so unwelcoming, now seemed familiar again. I passed fountains where the water sang softly in the stillness. Statues of forgotten gods no longer looked down with indifference, but seemed almost content, bathed in the quiet dignity of the night. For the first time in so long, I felt no need to lower my head. I walked tall, my chest light, my steps unhurried. And then, as I reached the small stone bridge that crossed a quiet branch of the Tiber, I saw him, the boy. He stood there at the center of the bridge, silhouetted against the moonlight, his thin form outlined by the soft glow of the river beneath. This time, he wasn't holding the mask. His hands were empty, and when he turned to face me, I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Relief, contentment. His eyes, still far older than his years, seemed softer now, freed from whatever burden they had carried. We stood there in silence, the night air cool against our faces, the gentle trickle of the river the only sound between us. I wanted to ask him who he truly was, a messenger of the gods, a spirit of the old ways, or simply a boy who had learned truths the rest of us had forgotten. But before I could speak, he lifted his hand not to wave, not to bid farewell, but simply to point toward the horizon. And I turned to look. Far beyond the sleeping city, The faintest hint of dawn was beginning to stir. Just a pale line of light against the deep purple of the night sky. The promise of a new day. When I turned back, he was already walking away, his small figure vanishing across the bridge and into the shadows of the far side. And this time, I didn't follow. I didn't need to. Somehow, I knew his journey was complete. And so was mine. That night, I returned to my workshop. But the man who crossed its threshold was not the same man who had left it that morning. The unfinished statue stood in the center, its smooth, blank face waiting patiently. And as the first golden light of dawn crept through the high window, I picked up my chisel. My hands no longer trembled. With each careful stroke, I began to shape the face I had feared for so long to create. Not a face of sorrow, not one of stoic pride, but a face that lived, one that laughed. And as the sun broke fully over the horizon, filling my workshop with light, I carved. And for the first time in my life, the stone felt warm beneath my hands. Morning came slowly, as if it too wished to linger a little longer in the peace that followed the night. The streets of Rome usually alive with the clamor of merchants and the rumble of wagons at first light remained hushed. There was no rush today. The city seemed to breathe in unison, savoring the stillness after the storm of joy that had passed through its heart. I stepped outside my workshop, the cool morning air brushing against my face like a gentle blessing. Above me, the sky was washed in pale gold and soft blue. The clouds stretched thin and delicate as silk. And for the first time in years, I felt no urgency to return to my tools, no weight pressing on my shoulders, demanding unfinished work. Instead, I walked, slowly, now that the laughter had faded and the masks had turned to ash. I wanted to see what remained. The great square was nearly empty when I arrived. Only a few figures moved quietly through the lingering morning mist, sweeping the stone steps, gathering the last fallen garlands, gently extinguishing the final lanterns that still flickered beneath the grand colonnades. Where the great effigy had stood the night before, only a blackened circle of ash remained, a faint wisp of smoke rising lazily into the air. And yet, there was no sadness here. In that simple empty space, I saw freedom. Freedom from the burdens we had all laid down. Freedom from the faces we had worn for far too long. I wandered toward the Temple of Jupiter once more. The high steps that had once seemed so imposing were bathed in the soft light of dawn. Gone were the silken banners and garlands. Yet the great stone faces carved into the temple's facade seemed somehow gentler now, their weathered features touched by the quiet grace of the morning. As I stood there, my gaze was drawn downward, and there, resting at the base of one of the great pillars, was a small, broken piece of clay. I crouched and picked it up. It was a fragment of a mask, cracked cleanly down the middle, the faint trace of a smile still visible along its curve. I turned it over gently in my hand. Even broken, even forgotten among the ashes, it held a quiet kind of beauty, proof that we had all chosen, even for one day, to set down our sorrows. I tucked the fragment into the fold of my cloak and continued walking. Through the empty markets where stallholders sat quietly with their morning bread, past fountains where the water seemed to sing more sweetly than before. And as the sun climbed higher, the city began to stir, not with the restless energy of duty and obligation, but with the calm assurance of a new beginning. Faces I passed seemed softer. Smiles came more easily. There was a lightness in the way people moved, as though the very air had become less heavy. And though the Festival of Laughter had officially ended, its spirit lingered like the delicate scent of spring blossoms on the breeze. When I returned to my workshop, I set the mask fragment gently on the windowsill where the light could find it. And I stood before the statue once more. The face was nearly complete now. Not a perfect face, but a real one. A face with lines etched by living. Eyes that seemed to understand both sorrow and joy. And a smile. Subtle, honest, unafraid. For the first time, I stepped back and looked at it not as a sculptor judging his work, but simply as a man. And I smiled back. That was the morning I learned a simple truth. Even after the fires burn out and the last echoes of laughter fade, what remains is the space we create within ourselves, space for lightness, for forgiveness, and for joy. And once you've made that space, it never quite leaves you again. The days that followed the Festival of Laughter passed gently like ripples over a still pond. And though the celebration had ended, the city seemed lighter. It wasn't something you could measure or point to directly. It was in the way people greeted one another on the streets with a warmth that hadn't been there before. In the way merchants laughed more easily when bargaining over a few extra coins. And how the children played longer in the open squares, their small wooden toys clattering joyfully against the stone without the sharp scolding of hurried parents. Even the city itself seemed to breathe more freely. The shadows that once gathered so tightly in the narrow alleys now seemed thinner, as though sunlight could finally reach places long hidden. The grand marble statues that lined the avenues, once cold and imposing, appeared somehow softer in the morning light. They hadn't changed, of course, but we had. And in that change, everything else seemed to follow. One afternoon, I found myself wandering through the southern quarter near the old market where I rarely went. It was there I stumbled upon a small gathering outside Lucilla's modest stall. Her table was covered in fresh clay masks, newly shaped, and left to dry in the soft sun. But this time, they weren't exaggerated with wild grins or comically wide eyes. They were simple, gentle, expressions of quiet contentment, some with faint smiles just beginning to form, as if caught in the very moment of remembering joy. Lucilla stood nearby, her hands streaked with clay, a knowing smile warming her weathered face. When she saw me, she nodded slowly. "See, Gaius," she said, her voice low and kind, "not every mask must hide a sorrow. Some are simply meant to remind us that joy still fits." I ran my fingers gently across the surface of one mask, feeling the soft ridges where her hands had shaped it, and I realized the masks weren't about pretending. They were about remembering, reminders of the faces we longed to wear openly, but sometimes forgot how. I thanked her quietly and continued on my way. Everywhere I went, I saw the small signs of change. An old stonecutter laughing softly to himself as he worked a man I knew had not smiled in years. A group of mothers gathered by a fountain telling stories and laughing freely as their children splashed nearby the water, catching the sunlight in tiny silver arcs. And late in the evening, as the last light faded and the streets grew calm, I heard the faintest echoes of song drifting from open windows. Soft lullabies, songs not of sorrow, but of peace. It was in those moments I understood what had truly changed. It wasn't that we had forgotten our hardships. The debts still existed. The long days of labor still waited. But for once, those things no longer defined us. For once, the weight of sorrow had loosened its grip. We had found space, if only a little, for lightness. And that, I realized, was enough. That evening I returned home as the sky blushed softly with the colors of dusk. The fragment of clay mask still sat on my windowsill, catching the last golden rays of sunlight. And as I looked out over the rooftops of Rome, I thought again of the boy on the bridge. I never saw him again after that night, but somehow it no longer felt like a mystery that needed solving. He had come and gone as quietly as a spring breeze, and like the festival itself, his presence had left behind something far greater than questions. It had left behind a memory and a reminder that sometimes the simplest acts, laying down a burden, sharing a moment of laughter, letting go of an old sorrow, are the most powerful things of all. It was on the 7th morning after the festival that I found it. The city had fully returned to its rhythm by then, merchants calling out their prices with cheerful voices, bakers filling the air with the scent of warm loaves, and children weaving through the streets with wild laughter trailing behind them like colorful ribbons. But even amidst this newfound lightness, something called me back to my workshop. I couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was a feeling, a quiet urging that there was still something unfinished waiting for me. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of stone dust and old olive oil lamps wrapped around me like an old friend. The morning light spilled through the high window, pooling softly on the floor where my unfinished statue stood. But today, there was something different. At the base of the statue, carefully placed where I could not miss it, lay a small object wrapped in simple linen. My heart stirred as I knelt to pick it up. The cloth was tied neatly with a thin strip of golden thread. No name, no message, but somehow I already knew who it was from. With trembling fingers, I untied the cloth and slowly unwrapped the object inside. It was a mask, small, perfectly formed, and carved from smooth ivory rather than clay. Unlike the crude, exaggerated masks of the festival, this one bore a soft, knowing smile, gentle creases at the corners of its eyes, a warmth etched into every curve of its face, and on the inside, delicately inscribed in a script so fine I had to tilt it toward the light to read were just 3 words. You remembered how? I sat back on my heels, the breath catching quietly in my chest. Though I would never hear his voice again, I could almost feel the boy standing there beside me, his dark eyes watching with that ancient calm. This was his final gift, not a mask to hide behind, but one to remember with, a symbol of the journey completed. A quiet promise that even in the hardest moments I would not forget how to smile. I held the mask gently in my hands for a long time, tracing its smooth edges, feeling the truth of those 3 simple words settle deep in my chest. Outside, the bells of the Forum began to ring, marking the rise of a new day. And as their echoes faded, I stood and walked to the statue. The face was nearly finished now, but I had saved one final touch for last. With steady hands, I lifted my chisel and began to carve the faintest smile, one not forced or exaggerated, but simple, real, and full of life. Each stroke felt like releasing a long-held breath, and when I stepped back at last, I saw him, the man I had dreamed of carving for so long. Not a hero, not a god, but a man who had known sorrow and learned to laugh again. And that, I realized, was more than enough. From that day forward, I kept the ivory mask on my workshop wall, just above the place where the sunlight fell in the afternoon. Not to hide behind, but to remind myself, that no burden is too great to set down, that no sorrow is so deep it cannot be lifted if only for a moment, and that even the faintest smile can be the beginning of a new life. Seasons passed, and yet some days it felt as though that festival had only just ended. Rome moved on as cities do. New monuments were planned, new leaders made promises. The weight of daily life returned, but it rested more gently on our shoulders now, as if the air itself had remembered how to be kind. And though the great fires had long faded, though the masks had turned to dust and been swept away with the spring winds, their spirit lingered. I often found myself pausing during my morning walks, standing perfectly still beneath the marble arches and listening, not for the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, not for the busy chatter of the marketplace, but for something far more subtle, a whisper, the faint playful echo of laughter, drifting through the narrow alleyways and quiet courtyards. It would rise, suddenly carried on a soft breeze, like the memory of a joyful moment that refused to fade. Some might say it was nothing but the wind, but those of us who lived through that festival, who stood by the fires and watched the masks fall away, knew better. That sound was a reminder, a promise that even in the darkest times, joy could return. And sometimes, it only needed the gentlest breeze to carry it back into our hearts. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the skies above Rome burned in shades of copper and deep rose, I found myself once again drawn to the old bridge over the Tiber, the very place where I had last seen the boy. The waters below moved slowly, their surface painted in the soft colors of dusk. I leaned against the worn stone rail, the coolness grounding me as I watched the world settle into night. And then, as if summoned by a memory, a breeze rose from the riverbanks. Soft and warm, it curled gently around me, and with it came that faint sound once more. A quiet laugh light and fleeting there and then gone. But this time, I didn't search for its source. I simply closed my eyes and smiled, letting it pass through me like an old friend brushing my shoulder in passing. It was enough to know it was still there, somewhere in the folds of the city, hidden between stone and sky, between memory and dream, that laughter lived on. In the days that followed, I began carving again more freely than ever before. Not for commission, not for glory, but for the simple joy of it. Faces filled my workshop now, each unique, each capturing some small spark of life. Smiles no longer hidden, eyes no longer downcast, and sometimes, as the afternoon light filtered through the high windows and painted the room in warm gold, I would swear I heard it again, a soft knowing chuckle rising from somewhere deep within the stone itself. And so, my friend, if ever you find yourself wandering through the ancient streets of Rome, if you pause beneath a quiet archway or lean against a forgotten pillar, listen, you might just hear it. A whisper of laughter in the wind. And should it find you, let it stay. Let it remind you that even the heaviest burdens can be set down, and that somewhere deep within you, a lighter heart still remembers how to ride. Years passed, and like all things in Rome, the city changed. New emperors rose and fell. New temples reached toward the heavens, while others crumbled quietly into the earth. But some things remained, not carved into monuments or etched into the grand records of history. No, these things lived on in simpler, quieter ways. In the way a stranger smiled kindly at another across a crowded market. In the soft songs hummed by mothers as they rocked their children to sleep under the cool marble arches. And sometimes, in the faintest echoes of laughter, caught on the evening breeze long after the streets had emptied, that I came to understand was how true legacies were built, not through battles or grand declarations, but through the small, enduring moments we leave behind. In the twilight of my years, I found myself visited more often by young apprentices eager to learn the art of shaping stone, their hands still unsure, their eyes filled with the restless hunger of youth. They came expecting to master the grand techniques to carve their names into history with perfect symmetry and flawless marble. But before I handed them a chisel, I told them a story about a forgotten spring, about a festival where the greatest burdens were not lifted by armies, but by something far simpler, a shared moment of joy. I would walk them to the center of my workshop, where my most cherished work stood. The statue I had once left unfinished, the man with the quiet smile, not perfect, but alive, a face that knew sorrow and yet still chose to smile through it. And beside him, resting always beneath the warm light of the afternoon sun, sat the small ivory mask, the final gift. I never hung it away, never sealed it behind glass. It remained there in plain sight, not as a relic, but as a reminder. I told them what the boy had taught me, that we must never carve only what the eye can see. We must learn to shape what the heart remembers, and in doing so, perhaps, leave behind something that outlives stone itself. Now, as I sit here with the cool evening breeze flowing through the open windows, I wonder if that boy was ever real at all. Or perhaps he was something else, a spirit of the old ways, or simply the forgotten part of myself returned to guide me back to the lightness I had lost. But it no longer matters, because what he left behind lives on in the softened hearts of those who learned to laugh again, in the peaceful eyes of my apprentices as they craft their own imperfect, beautiful creations, and perhaps in the laughter that still whispers through these old streets when no one is looking. That is enough. And so, dear traveler, if ever you feel the weight of the world pressing too heavily on your shoulders, if you find yourself forgetting the sound of your own laughter, remember this story. Remember that even the greatest cities must sometimes stop and simply learn to laugh again. And in doing so, they leave behind a legacy far greater than stone. A legacy written not in monuments, but in the lightness of a heart that remembers how to rise. So tonight, as you rest, let your own burdens fall away. Close your eyes, and if the wind stirs gently against your window, listen closely. You just might hear it. A faint, familiar sound. The soft, eternal echo of laughter carried through time.